wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day and rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory.
How do we view life? You see, many times we view life as something that passes by. In other words, there's a lot of day-to-day things that go on, and before we know it, the day is over. And it seems that as we can sit here for a moment and look back on, let's just say for me, the past 2 years, life has flown by. How do we value life? See, we usually value life in some idea like that. We value life based on time. There's nothing wrong with that, but I want to challenge our minds tonight to value life on faithfulness. Faithfulness. I want us to spend some time tonight going back into Genesis chapter 37. If you'll go ahead and turn there, that's where we're going to start. And we're going to have to see 4 things that have to do with life, and then look at a couple of things that have to do with our outlook on life. How do we value life? You see, as you enter into Genesis chapter 37, I want you to begin with me in verse 3. Genesis chapter 37, I want you to begin with me in verse 3. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. One of the things I want us to note when we think about life is to think about faithfulness. And we need to understand that we are not victims of our circumstances. We are not victims of our circumstances. As we live every day, things are going to happen that are out of our control. The way people treat us in many aspects are out of our control. Now understand, we must be treating people right. Don't think I'm telling you treat them bad and they'll treat you good. But in many cases, the way others interact with us is out of our control. In many cases, sometimes our health, though we may exercise properly, eat the right diet, do the right things, our health many times we find is out of our control. You see, the things that happen to our home. When is the air conditioner going to go out? Well, I don't know. 3 weeks ago, I can tell you when it went out. When's the roof going to start leaking? You remember recently at the building we had to fix one of our baptistry changing rooms because the roof leaked and it dropped the sheetrock. Is that convenient for any? We're not victims of our circumstances in health, in interactions, in all of the things that we do. And when you focus in on Genesis chapter 37, verses 3 and 4, we find ourselves talking about one who was loved and at the same time he was hated. He was not a victim of his circumstances. You follow on down in what happens to this young man, and you're going to find in the second place, he had to endure unpleasant circumstances. Go to Genesis 37 and go all the way down to verse 23. Genesis 37, verse 23. And it came to pass when Joseph was coming to his brethren, they stripped Joseph out of his coat of many colors that was on him, and they took him and cast him into a pit. And the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. You see, sometimes we only think that in life everyone is out to get us. You ever had one of those days where nothing was going right, nobody was nice to you, and you were just waiting on what was going to happen next? Here's one of those days. Remember, he was loved of his father, hated of his brethren, and now he's been thrown into a pit. Sometimes we think that everyone's out to get us, but we need to realize something, and it's something that we see here in Joseph with his circumstances. They were unpleasant circumstances. He was stripped of the coat of which would have been a prize, would have been a precious and most likely a very expensive item to have. And it certainly was an item of which would have been a love-hate item, wouldn't it? He had his coat, but at the same time, he had his hatred. Not from him, but from others. At the same time, he had his coat, but he had the love of his father. So we see this. So he's been thrown into a pit, but we need to back up and look at verse 19 of Genesis 37. And they said one to another, "Behold, this dreamer cometh." Now he had given them some dreams that he had had. And look at verse 20. "Come now, therefore, and let us slay him." Pause for just a minute. Who is saying this? And of whom are they saying it? Well, we know this is about Joseph. And it brings our minds back to verses 3 and 4, his brethren, and we go back to that word, hated. They hated him. Here, his own brothers see him coming, and think of the first thing that they say. Let's kill him. Joseph had to endure unpleasant circumstances. They say, "Come now, therefore, and let us slay him and cast him into some pit. And we will say, some evil beast hath devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." Look at verse 21. He had to endure hard and unpleasant circumstances, but usually in these circumstances is what we'll call tonight a ray of hope. "And Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands and said, Let us not kill him." Now that's an interesting phrase, because when you read verse 20, you think, oh, he's still on his way. But when you get to verse 21, you realize Reuben heard it and he delivered him out of their hands. They had already taken hold of him. And Reuben steps in and intervenes. And Reuben says in verse 22, we find, "And Reuben said to them, Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit that is in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him, that he might rid him out of their hands, to deliver him unto his father again." So look at verse 23. "And it came to pass, when Joseph was come unto his brethren, they stripped him out of his coat of many colors that was on him, and they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it." You see, in this particular occasion, we can only imagine what was going on. He was stripped of his prized garment. He was stripped of his family. If you calculate it out to what it was, their hatred had stripped him of his family. And he was sitting down in a pit of which he could not get himself out. And in the scenes of your imagination, follow this. And in the scenes of his imaginations, left to die. But we understand something about Joseph. Joseph was blessed. We know as we follow the rest of chapter 37, there are going to be some individuals coming through who were buying and selling in different areas. We find in verse 28, the Midianite merchantmen came by. They drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. So here he was in his homeland this morning. He was the child of which his father loved. He was an individual who had a family. But in the snap of a finger, his family's gone. His prized coat was gone. And he was in Egypt. Joseph had to endure unpleasant circumstances, but he also was blessed. You move a little bit fast-paced into Genesis chapter 39, and we start to see some things happening. Genesis chapter 39, we see that Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and he ended up being sold into Egyptian slavery. Remember, we're entitling this point, Joseph was blessed. I want you to look at 3 different passages, and then we're going to follow the circumstances that are around this to see that Joseph was blessed. And then we're going to ask this question, my favorite question. Why? Look at verse 2. "And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Look at verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Look at verse 23. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. You see, if you take those three passages and ignore the word prison, it seems that Joseph's life is great. But I don't know if you've noticed this or really remember this. Verse 2, he's introduced into his Egyptian owners. Verse 21, he found favor in the sight of listen to this, the keeper of the prison. Verse 23, the keeper of the prison. What's his location? Number 1, he's in slavery. Number 2 and 3 in 21 and 23, he is in prison. Now that's a day that's gone from bad to worse to we can't even think about it anymore. Not only was he sold into slavery, he was a man who had to deal with the term faithfulness. Here's where we're going to get into this question, why? Why Genesis 39:2? Why Genesis 39:21? Why Genesis 39:23? Why was God on the side of Joseph? And it has to do with the word faithfulness. If you go to Genesis 39 and make your way down to verse 6, we need to read something here. Here, the one who has Joseph left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well-favored. Continue reading into verse 7. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." To put it into the scenes of how we can make a modern application, she said, "Hey, come on, let's sin." Now, I know we do not hear that in the day-to-day operations of our lives, but in reality we do. We get offered to do this and to do that, and some of those things in our daily lives violate the standard that God has set before us. Whether it's the thing that's being talked about here in Genesis 39, verse 7, or it is other things of which transgress the law of God, we are all, at some point in time in our lives, tempted. Whether it be by our circumstances or those that are directly around us. Here it's the one that's directly around him. Look at verse 8, and we start to begin to build this idea. But he refused and said unto his master's wife, "Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath into my hand." Now notice verse 9 that was read so well for us just a moment ago. "There is none greater in this house than I. Neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness," and listen to this, "and sin against God?" The definition of faithfulness should really come from Genesis 39, verse 9. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Now, no, I'm not discussing the idea of faithfulness to doctrine, even though I think that has a lot to do with our faithfulness in our decisions. No, I'm not talking about faithfulness in attending worship, but I hope you understand what I'm talking about. In our day-to-day, everyday lives, are we faithful to God? Genesis 39, 7 through 9 was a day-to-day, every day for him. And he had to make the decision, am I going to be faithful to God or not? We learned some things about Joseph. We learned, number 1, he is faithful to God, Genesis 39, verse 9. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? We learned, number 2, Joseph's view of God. You see, when one respects someone, he is cautious. When one respects someone, he is cautious. Now, no, not cautious of what he does around him, but yes, he is conscious of the things of which he does in his life. Number 3, we learn Joseph is one who respects marriage. That seems to be a phrase of which our world has no idea. I believe it was the Methodist Church recently who has disavowed its views on marriage. Not in the traditional way you would think of, but they have allowed their first homosexual priest or bishop or however they call it into their ranks. And inside of the article, it mentioned this phrase, Methodist doctrine. Now, I don't choose that as an example to pick out those who may be Methodist. Joseph respected marriage. And in all of the things in life, we show forth what we respect. He wasn't going to do such, and look at how he calls it, wickedness. We could learn a lot from this. If we viewed sin as wickedness that destroys the value or the sanctity of certain items, such as marriage. Take the article or take the idea of abortion. If we viewed life as something that was sacred, something that was valuable, we would never take it. Same thing is true with sin. If we saw the soul as something that was valuable, and if we saw sin as something that was wickedness, and we saw God as someone who was holy, and we had the ability to say and to sin against God, it would change our view on faithfulness. So Joseph was blessed. Now we ask this question, why? Why was God with Joseph? I want to say it in this sentence, and hopefully this will come out as I think it is in my mind. The reason God was with Joseph is because Joseph was with God. You see the understanding there? Joseph placed forth in the front of his life God. And thus when sin entered the forefront of his eyes, it was a great wickedness. And how can he sin against God? You see, the first thing that was in his mind was God. Now, no, we're not saying today that if we are faithful, God will make everything, according to verse 21 and verse 23, everything that our hands touch to prosper. But yes, we understand that God will stand on our side. And thus he did with Joseph, who was blessed. We need to notice one other thing. Not only did Joseph have to make a decision, we learn that Joseph maintained his purity. Purity comes in many forms. Of course, it comes in what's happening here in verses 7 through 9. It comes in our decisions. It comes visually. Purity can be defined as visual purity. What do our eyes see? Ears can go the same way. You can use the feet. Where do we go? Directional purity. Aspects of purity can go in great different ways. But Joseph maintained his purity under his time with Potiphar. Joseph was promoted, and that seems to be a thing with Joseph. However, we understand verses 7 through 9, someone else had different ideas. Did Joseph make the right decision when he said, how can I do this great wickedness and how can I sin against God? The answer is yes. But we need to understand not only was he on God's side, but sometimes the right decision brings about persecution. And thus, when you look at what happens beginning in verse 10 to the end of the chapter, verse 12, she caught him by his garments, and he left his garments in her hand and fled and got him out. And it came to pass when she saw that he had left his garment with her and fled forth, that she called the men of her house, spake unto them, saying, See, hath brought an Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. His decision for faithfulness ended up being a decision inside of persecution. However, we go back to point number 1 today. We are not victims of our circumstances. We are not victims of our circumstances. In the end, as you go through Genesis, you make your way to Genesis chapter 45, verse 5, and we understand that all of these things are going to work out. Joseph's going to make his way out of prison. Joseph's going to continue to be promoted, and even those who came to him were going to come back to him, or those who sent him to Egypt, his brothers, are going to come back. Notice with me Genesis 45, verse 5. Now therefore be not grieved, here Joseph is saying unto his brethren, nor angry with yourselves that ye sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. Joseph ends up being a man of reconciliation, a man, as we talked about this morning, of forgiveness. So let's add some ideas of faithfulness in just the few minutes we have remaining to give us an idea here. Number 1, as we go to the New Testament, as we think of this individual, we go back to John chapter 1. John chapter 1. And we need to see something about Joseph. Joseph is a type of Christ. And we need to see something of Christ so we can see some things of ourselves. John chapter 1, verse 1, talking about Jesus. Verse 11, talking about Jesus. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. We need to understand, and we need to know this as a fact. We need to understand this as a possibility. We need to be prepared for John 1:11 and Genesis 37 through 45. There may be people who oppose us as Christians, but we must remember we're not victims of our circumstances. People may treat us how they want to treat us, but who are we? We're children of God. Joseph was treated in what I would describe as one of the vilest ways, but yet he was faithful unto God. When sin was presented to him, one of which most would follow through with, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? In John 1, verse 11, when Jesus came unto his own and his own rejected him, for many it would be a time of which to say, I'm not going to do this anymore. Because sometimes we think more of what others think of us than we think of what God thinks of us. We must learn to live like Christ. We must learn to endure. Go with me to John chapter 18. John chapter 18. We're going to read just verse 12. To make the impact of something that's happening here and to understand that we must endure no matter what is surrounding us. We must be faithful no matter what is surrounding us, and we'll do so with the life of Christ. John 18, verse 12. Then the band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him. It was the scenes of Jesus preparing his entry into the trials. Notice that he did not fight. Notice that he did not kick and scream. Notice the faithfulness. When you go all the way back to the book of Genesis, Genesis 37 and Genesis 39 and Genesis 45, notice the attitude of Joseph. He was not a victim of his circumstances. Jesus was not a victim of his circumstances. And we are not a people who are a victim of our circumstances. There may come a day, and I pray every day that this day never comes. Not in my generation, not in my son's generation, not in his son's generation. I pray that there will never be a day of which these doors are locked and not of our locking. What will we do when the day comes that they will not allow us to worship in this place? What will come of us when they say, if you worship, and we catch you, you'll go to prison. Will we stop? What would the right decision be? To worship. What will be that decision inside of prison? To worship. Even inside of the bowels of prison, who was Joseph? He was the follower of God. Jesus inside the bounds of captivity, inside of what's happening in John chapter 18, who was he? He was the faithful one. And who are we? We're not victims of our circumstances. We must be a people who see what's happening. Also go with me to Matthew chapter 4. There's something I want to see. I believe this is an account of which we know very well. Matthew chapter 4, 1 through 11. We study God's Word so often. I know many of you do at home and at other occasions in life. You're here on Sunday mornings for Bible class and worship. You're here tonight. You'll be here on Wednesday. I know most of you take advantage of Channel 98 if you have that in your area, or find some other things online to study. I know you do that. But it's apt for us to remember what all of this is good for. Of course, we understand it's good for Christian living. It's good for understanding Scripture, but it's good for being prepared. Another scene of someone not being a victim of his circumstances in Matthew chapter 4, 1 through 11. Jesus was led up, verse 1, into the wilderness and tempted of the devil. And when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he would afterward hungered. And when the tempter came to him, he said, "If thou be the Son of God, command these stones to be made bread." And what did he do? Well, we usually say he said what he said in Matthew 4, verse 4. But he quoted Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3. You go all the way down into verse 5. The devil takes him up into the holy city and set him on a pinnacle of the temple. And said unto him, "If thou be the Son of God, cast thyself down, for it is written, He shall give his angels charge concerning thee, and their hands shall bear thee up, lest at any time thou shalt dash thy foot against a stone." What did he say? We usually say, well, he said what he said in Matthew 4, verse 7. But he quoted Deuteronomy 6:16. We see again in verse 8, again the devil taketh him up into an exceeding high mountain, and showeth him all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them. And said unto him, "All these things will I give thee, if thou wilt fall down and worship me." What happens in verse 10? Well, we usually say that was his response. But he quoted Deuteronomy 6:13. Bible study. It's not just something we do when we come together for worship. It's something we do so we can use it in days of temptation. It's something we do so we can see the beauty inside of God's Word. And it's something we do so we can, as Joseph did, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? We do so in the pursuit for knowledge inside of how we view life in faithfulness.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a